Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the CGR Data webinar. Today is a great pleasure to have Daven Quinn speaking with us from University of Wisconsin-Madison. So Daven got his undergraduate degree in University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Actually, so it's a lovely time that I visited in 2019, August, because I have a colleague there. And then he moved to Caltech for his PhD. After that, Daven has joined the Macrostrat lab at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So he's going to talk about the lab as well as the science and the database behind it. So as far as I know, that the Macrostrat is one of the first pioneering data-driven work or lab in the geology community, not in the geophysics though. That really is starting from the data science point to help the geology questions. So also raises quite interesting points. So by that, I give the rest time to Daven. And normally our webinar lasts for about, speak for about 40-45 minutes. Then we have some time, 15 minutes or so, to interact with our participants. So with that, Daven, please.
Okay, thank you for the introduction and thank you for the opportunity to speak here today. I'm fortunate to be here, especially because I was traveling today, actually back from a meeting of the Deep Time Digital Earth in Paris with many colleagues from around the world, including many from China, to talk about the emerging large amount of work going on in compiling digital data sets in the geosciences. So I just traveled back earlier today from that. And of course, it's a snowstorm here in Madison. So it was a little tenuous whether I would be able to make it, but here I am. So good for us, but excited to continue talking about these topics. So I'll take us through Macrostrat today. And as Zhenjiang said, it's one of kind of a pioneering of this new approach of doing geoscience, which really puts building data resources first. And so building a data resource that can be a common core for many scientific studies and is maintained to support a variety of studies, and then building different studies and then also ways to share data with the community on top of that. So I'll go through some of the ways we built Macrostrat, how it's structured, and how we use it for science, and then shift to talking about how we use Macrostrat to support new ways for the community to interact with geoscience data. So first, Macrostrat's basic structure. It was conceived of actually in about 2004 by my supervisor here at University of Wisconsin, Dr. Shannon Peters, following on work from the 1980s, primarily in Russia by Alexander Ronov, and in the 1990s at the University of Chicago, focusing on quantifying the rock record and its changes through time. And the way that we chose to do that, or Dr. Peters chose to do that at the time, was essentially to tabulate a set of stratigraphic columns describing rock record information in a wide variety of sites globally. And so the start of this system, and still today the core of it, is a North American data set that is spatially complete. You can see on this map here, we have all of these polygons that trace North America, with some in Central America and some throughout South America, and then a scattering in the ocean. So these are stratigraphic columns that are individually described, and they're regional level summaries of geologic information organized as a stacking of rocks, both in stratigraphic height and through the basic principle of stratigraphic superposition in geologic time. So this is essentially a lithostratigraphic and chronostratigraphic framework for the Earth's crust. So columns are composed of stratigraphic units, which are rock packages denoted by just tabular entries in a database, which have a stratigraphic name associated with them, and then properties such as their basic characteristics, the lithology, the thickness, environmental attributes such as marine or inferred superficial, whether it is a shale, etc. So the basic lithologic properties of this rock unit, and then linked to a very, very comprehensive notion of the lithostratigraphic nomenclature. So the names applied to rock units. And this is actually a very important and separate piece of this column data set, is that we have ways to understand which units in adjacent columns link together and are part of the same geomorphic body or geologic body, even if they are named differently, as is often the case between different sedimentary basins. Then the boundaries between these units in a stratigraphic column. Here is a visualization of one of our regional Macrostrat stratigraphic columns showing the stacking of units, but also the time stratigraphic orientation of this data set. And you can see units are bounded by surfaces that have meaning in geologic time. So they're either continuous boundaries where one unit is on top of the other, and as far as our regional scale, low resolution stratigraphic model knows, they're continuous deposition through that time, or they're bounded by unconformities where there is a known break in deposition and then a resumption later, represented by these gaps. And these tabulations of surfaces, unlike a simple lithostratigraphic model where you just record the stacking of rocks, allows us to build up a sense of geologic time that is continuous. So there is a continuous time age model applied to these rock formations, where units with known age boundaries, usually from stage boundaries or more finely known constraints, are interpolated linearly between them to form a continuous understanding of the rock record through time. So this chronostratigraphic framework is one that can be applied to many different columns. So on the left, we have a column from the Western United States in Paradox Basin. And on the right, we have a column that actually comes from a single drill core in the Northern Namibia platform, carbonate platform in, or Proterozoic carbonate platform, now the Kalahari Basin in Northern Namibia. But the principles are the same between widely separated basins. It's just a recording of stratigraphy in a fairly familiar format to most geologists of this chronostratigraphic column. And what this forms is essentially a basic scaffold of the Earth's crust. So a framework where we set out the boundaries between units, both their thickness and stacking pattern, and also their time stratigraphic pattern, so that we can then track the properties of those rock units through time. So a very simple design that is focused on just understanding the basic properties of rock. But it allows us to do some pretty interesting things. So this is a classic graph of the output of a macrostrat analysis. And what we are able to do using our continuous time age model and our knowledge of the amount of rock in each of these columns at any given time is we're able to tabulate just the amount of sedimentary rock that was present in the Earth system, at least for North America, where our main data set is, through geologic time. And so this is a graph which on the x-axis is from the Archean to the present, and on the y-axis is the area of continental sedimentary rock, or sorry, shallow marine sedimentary rock that was being deposited at that time. So areas on the globe where there is a sedimentary rock with a depositional age crossing through that age. And then this is divided further where carbonate sedimentary rocks are in this blue, and the siliciclastic sedimentary rocks are the remainder of this area. And we see basically a few different characteristics. So we see low amounts of deposition of sedimentary rocks with a rise in the Paleoproterozoic, and then a low value of deposition during the Mesoproterozoic and Neoproterozoic, and then this sudden spike in preserved sedimentary rock area at the start of the Paleozoic. And so this is the Cambrian boundary recorded in the sedimentary rock record. And this is something that geologists have known about for many years, since probably the 1850s, but or if not before, but and have commonly understood as a very significant boundary in the Earth system, and not just because of animal fossils, but because it was hard to find rocks that were older than that. And this view of Macrostrat actually bears that out with a quantified understanding, where we can say, yes, not only does this appear in our qualitative understanding of the rock record, but when we run the numbers and just see how much rock there was, it turns out that that boundary is a very significant break. So this provides us with some assurance that what we're seeing qualitatively is correct, but also allows us to do more quantitative analysis that explores these facts that we know to be true about the geologic record. And one other aspect of this age model that's interesting is it allows us to look at or assign ages to rock units that may not have well-established ages in their own right. And so this is looking at a Paleoproterozoic stratigraphy in the Canadian Shield. And actually, there are very few good age constraints on this stratigraphy. There are some basalt sills that are dated in various parts of it, but we can interpolate ages through this using our continuous time age model and at least put the rocks in the right period of Earth history where they can contribute to an understanding of the bulk Earth system. So with this basic stratigraphic data system, which has recorded regional scale columns across one continental craton through geologic time, the Macrostrat team, led by Shannon Peters and with other postdocs and collaborators over the past 10 years or so, has been able to do some pretty interesting science, basically looking at the contribution of the rock record and the quantity of sedimentary rocks and fluxes of sediments, sedimentary rock deposition and erosion to geologic processes over time. And so this has been set against fossils to look at the great unconformity and potentially the triggers for the Cambrian explosion. It's been set against oxygen and organic carbon records, and it's been set against other proxies to look at different aspects of the Earth system, especially in its deep paths. And many of these papers have been focused on the large-scale changes we've seen associated with the Precambrian-Cambrian boundary. And so here's one example that I'll briefly show to illustrate how we go about doing science with this approach. And so this is a paper written by John Husson, a former postdoc at Macrostrat and now a professor at University of British Columbia. And he looked at how the atmosphere has responded to changes in the rock record. And basically what was proposed by this study was that there's a rise in global oxygen during the Proterozoic and into the Phanerozoic that's probably associated with the rise of animal life, multicellular life that can take advantage of higher levels of oxygen to do more complex biotic things. And it's been unclear what exactly caused that rise in oxygen, because it happens after the great oxygenation at the beginning of the Proterozoic, but nevertheless is a major signal that seems to be controlling of biologic life. And so this study proposes that changes in sedimentary deposition were a major control of this oxygenation. And so basically, the model here, which was proposed by other workers prior to this, was essentially that one way that oxygen enters the surface Earth system is as part of CO2 that is outgassed from the mantle or from weathering of silicate rocks. And so this, there's CO2 entering the surface system, and there's also a flux of organic carbon being buried from biologic activity in sediments. And we actually know quite well, given the description of sedimentary rocks by geologists, which sedimentary rock types are likely to contain organic carbon and approximately how much. And so what we're showing here on the right of this panel is basically different measures of sedimentary volume flux of organic carbon into sedimentary rocks. And so we're measuring stratigraphy with Macrostrat and then tabulating the amount of organic carbon that we expect will be archived in these rocks. So this is organic carbon that is not accessible now to the surface Earth system in the atmosphere. And so the oxygen that is associated with that carbon becomes free to be in the atmosphere by itself. And so basically the proposal is organic carbon burial allows the rise of atmospheric oxygen. And so a model was built using this organic carbon sediment flux, which closely matches the amount of oxygen increase that is thought to occur in the latest Proterozoic. So this is one way that we can propose links and actually test the links between the surface Earth system and the sedimentary rock record. And other studies using Macrostrat's core data set have followed this similar pattern. So another thing that we are able to do with Macrostrat is actually think about combining different data sets with this basic stratigraphic data set. And the first and most major data set that we've endeavored to combine with the stratigraphic columns is geologic maps. And that is because geologic maps are a very different way to look at the rock record that is focused on its spatial coverage on the surface Earth rather than its detailed history through geologic time. And so Macrostrat in about 2016 set out to compile a database of geologic maps to go along with its stratigraphic columns. And the way Macrostrat has structured its geologic map database for several reasons, both for doing science and also for providing a valuable representation for community use purposes, is as a multi-scale geologic mapping database. So we archived geologic maps at different scale, about 300 of them, that allow us to have a large scale zoomed out view, regional scale views, and detailed views of geology in as many places on the globe as we can find maps for. So our geologic map database has more than 300 sources at the current moment, and more are being added on an ongoing basis. And we have global coverage with the geologic map of the world that was published in 2005. And we're working to integrate with the new geologic map of the world that is coming out shortly from the Committee for the Geologic Map of the World in Paris. But we also have regional and local scale maps in many areas of the globe, chiefly, as you can see here, in Western North America, where we have mapping down to the quadrangle scale. And so we harmonize these maps into a single database with 4 different scales of detail that are available at any given location. And then we dynamically composite these into a single product that can be viewed in a single database or in a single viewer. And so this is a computationally expensive step, but it allows the maps to be used together. An important point to make is that these maps aren't seamless in the sense that a lot of geologic mappers think about, in that we do not worry about different mapping representations between jurisdictions and mapping compilations. We focus on compiling the best available map for any given region. And even though boundaries between maps are often apparent in our database, the product is quite useful and harmonized nonetheless. And so we have found this not to be an impediment for scientific or visualization uses of this map. So this map, although it is representable as a single product, and we can show it in a single web interface and in GIS as a single product, et cetera, it carries source information from each map that makes it up. So any given unit of this map, you can go back to the original source map and find the link back to it and explore the details of the PDF map often that it came from. So although this is a unified database, it is also in some ways just an index of mapping done by other organizations that we have compiled in one easy to view site. So the real power of Macrostrat's approach, and the real reason that we want to compile all of these maps in the same data system as we're compiling stratigraphy, is we can actually link the columns to the geologic maps in a powerful way. And the way that we do this is we are able to take the spatial footprints of our stratigraphic columns, right here, regional column with a coarse level of spatial detail, roughly a 30 kilometer by, or I think 100 kilometer by 100 kilometer footprint, and overlay that on a geologic map and actually find links between individual units in the stratigraphy and units in the geologic map. So these are units with map descriptions matching a specific unit known to our stratigraphic column database. So even though these are completely separate data compilations, we can link the two together readily using our stratigraphic name database. Once we link these map units together, our age model provides a powerful additional constraint on the geologic map. So in the center of this right-hand column, you can see that we have matched the Chinle Formation to its column representation from the geologic map. And there is an age that is provided in the geologic map legend that is a broad age, I think in this case, Jurassic. And we are actually able to refine it to a much narrower age, or sorry, Triassic. And we're able to refine it to a much narrower age range of the early Triassic using our continuous time age model from the Macrostrat columns. And somewhat counterintuitively, this process of age refinement also works extremely well for crystalline rock units. Even though these are not stratigraphic units in the sedimentary sense, they're included in many cases in our stratigraphic columns, and individual plutons often have extremely well-known age constraints that enable them to be dated quite accurately. And so in this case, while the geologic map description puts this unit as the Baker's Bridge granite as part of a bin of Mesoproterozoic units. We're actually able to, Paleoproterozoic units. We're actually able to refine this to a much narrower Cetharian age with about a 30 million year age bin. So this is a very robust way to tighten the map age constraints and bring more power to a geologic mapping data set through careful application of stratigraphy. So one other database that we are able to harmonize with Macrostrat is the paleobiology database. So many in the fossil community and the paleobiology community obviously use this database and have for 2 decades or so to record fossil occurrences in the rock record. And what we're able to do is actually here show the top graphs here are similar to the initial graph of Macrostrat that I showed of sediment area for marine rocks and non-marine rocks on the right over time. So marine and terrestrial. And then on the bottom, we're actually able to superimpose genus diversity of fossil occurrences. So this is diversity calculated from the paleobiology database over the rock unit type and show that these are marine fossil occurrences, and then contrast that with non-marine fossil occurrences on the right-hand panel. And so we can see a clear difference that we would expect with marine fossil occurrences flourishing in the Cambrian to Ordovician, and then the total diversity declining since then, before increasing again in the Jurassic, while we see a kind of much more gradual increase starting in the Silurian to Devonian and moving to the present for terrestrial genus diversity. So this is again a signal that we would expect given what we know about how life evolved on Earth, but it's a nice one to see quantified in such a way. So bringing fossils together with stratigraphy can help in this way. One of the nice things we're able to do by bringing the fossil database together with Macrostrat's harmonized map, and this is some recent work that was done by a graduate student who just received his PhD, Shan Yi, is we're actually able to show first that, well, this is an obvious starting point, is that fossil occurrences captured in the paleobiology database are heavily weighted towards high-income countries. So we see many fossil occurrences tabulated in Europe, some here in southern China that you can see, and many out of view in North America, but none in Africa, or not none, but very few in Arabia, very few in the Indian subcontinent. So we wonder how many fossils are missing? How many fossil occurrences should we be finding in these areas? And the naive way to do this would be to assume that anywhere where we haven't seen dense sampling of fossils found should be where we find fossils. And so in that case, we have a lot of work to do because these whole continental areas are uncovered. But in fact, what we can do with a geologic map that's harmonized and has good age control is look at the areas where rock units of a specific age should be exposed at the surface in a way where we could find fossils easily. So if fossils aren't accessible, then we shouldn't find fossils in those regions. And the sampling of the paleobiology database should be low. And what we actually find from this work is interesting, is that actually sub-Saharan Africa and the Indian subcontinent actually are not very undersampled in fossils because they are largely, their bedrock is largely formed of crystalline basement or sedimentary rock units that are not of ages where extensive fossil deposits would be likely to be found. Whereas in some areas of South America, and particularly Northern Eurasia and some areas of Indonesia and Australia, we would expect more fossil occurrences to be sampled than we actually see. So this illuminates where work needs to be done. These types of approaches are combining with other data collection pushes, hopefully coming up through efforts like the GeoBio database in China and other efforts to enhance collection of these fossil occurrences in key intervals that have been undersampled. So another emerging approach that we are taking is to combine stratigraphic columns with geochronology and geochemistry data set, again, filling this space-time scaffold with information that can be used to evaluate the rock record over time. And so this is one example with detroidal zircon data sets, which we can show thousands of detroidal zircon samples with hundreds of grain ages in each sample, showing the depositional footprint of a given sandstone data set or terrestrial sandstone in the continental North America. And then we can show the depositional age of those sandstone units and use that in further analysis. Another thing we can do is look at geochemical data sets and track chemostratigraphy against our stratigraphic data sets. And this is something that's done often for individual stratigraphic columns, but the ability to track these chemostratigraphic trends regionally against a harmonized column data set is something that hasn't been explored by the community more broadly. One of the reasons it's really valuable to link stratigraphy and geochronology is because it's two different representations of geologic time, absolute and relative. And Macrostrat is implicitly tied to absolute time through its links to known stratigraphic pins, such as GSSPs and units with known depositional age boundaries. Those often come from geochronology. However, there is a lot of data in the geochronology community that is untapped by Macrostrat for detailed ages. Here's one example of a 548 million year age pin just above the Cambrian boundary in Namibia. And so this is one area where we need to improve Macrostrat's age control by linking with geochronology. So this is a project that I've been working on since I started as a postdoc at University of Wisconsin. And it's a complex one because it is a linking of our simple stratigraphic database with a field with a lot of its own internal complexity. So here's an example of an argon-argon labs dating workflow and all of the data that needs to be captured and tabulated to successfully record an age. So this is a process that takes months to record a single date that would then be used to pin a sedimentary deposit. And often the source data for these steps are recorded in ways that are not really accessible to data science methods. So individual Excel sheets stored for each dated grain, for example. So this is something we're working to improve by bringing context and context to these analytical data sets and trying to put them in a form that is more easily read by machines in bulk. So that involves linking the sample locations to the analytical data, to the interpretations, and to the final publication. And then hoping that these data can be used in a way where the users don't have to be experts in the field of argon geochemistry to be able to use that age to constrain stratigraphic data sets. And so we're working on data pipelines from geochemical labs into Macrostrat and other data systems. And the way that we're choosing to do this is by building software systems to sit within a geochronology lab or geochemistry lab. And so the idea of how this works is essentially that we start from this data reduction sheet, we build importers to ingest a subset of columns from summary data sheets, and then eventually structure these into nodes of meaningful data that can be tracked in a database, a relational database, instead of in a spreadsheet. And then from this, we can build standardized tools to feed this data out to Macrostrat and other linkers or archivers of this data in the community. And so the idea is that the lab maintains a data transfer endpoint that will serve the need of all customers of its data, and thus decrease work for the labs and hopefully provide more access to the data. So this is kind of a data pipeline view of what we're doing, but the goal of it is essentially to get us into the position of doing science with large quantities of geochronology data. And so this is a recent study that we did focused on the area of igneous rock in the continental crust. And basically how we structured this was looking at the area of igneous rocks exposed on the Earth's surface from our geologic map, and looking at the quantity of detrital zircons stored in sedimentary rocks in the crust. So this is essentially a linking between detrital zircon samples through stratigraphic columns to a geologic map. So using Macrostrat as a way to link these diverse data sets. And then we're able to basically look at detrital zircon age densities. So through a whole data set of rocks, the density of ages at any given time of grains in these samples. And we can see different peaks of grain ages, one in the Archean, one in the Paleoproterozoic, two in the Mesoproterozoic, and so forth. And these peaks coarsely align with this black curve, which is the area of igneous rocks at that time. So many igneous rocks in the Archean age, a smaller peak in the Paleoproterozoic, a smaller peak again in the Mesoproterozoic, and again, a much smaller peak in the Neoproterozoic. So this decreasing amplitude of peaks of igneous area is a record of continental crustal growth. And then the zircons in sedimentary data sets are sourced from these igneous rocks. However, there's many more zircons that we see in continental crust or in sedimentary rocks from more recent igneous episodes. So what we can take from that is there's a huge amount of missing zircon that probably has been taken from these igneous rocks and eroded and basically deposited in the ocean basins and is lost to the surface Earth system. So this is a data set that we're just starting to unpack, but essentially we can form a very rich record of continental crustal erosion and sediment cycling by layering detrital zircon and geologic mapping data sets with these stratigraphic columns. So thinking about where we go from here with Macrostrat, the biggest thing that Macrostrat currently lacks, because it has an approach that is very valuable for doing science at this large scale, is essentially coverage of mapping and stratigraphic columns across the world. Right now, we're working at a single continent scale for many of these scientific analyses. And this approach more properly should be applied at a global scale. So getting coverage of the rest of the globe is critical. And the way that we are hoping to do this is essentially to improve collaboration. And this really requires a reworking of Macrostrat's platform, not its basic approach, but a addition of many different software tools focused on improving collaboration. So software to visualize maps, columns, and models, geologic models, and tools for data entry by a wider range of contributors. Another thing that Macrostrat needs is the ability to support science at multiple scales. Right now, Macrostrat is very focused on the largest scale of stratigraphic analysis, thinking about the whole Earth system over geologic time. And that's very appropriate for solving global scale problems of continental evolution, of the Earth life system and its evolution, but solving problems at finer scales, such as basin scale tectonostratigraphic systems, evolutions over smaller time periods, and smaller scale adjustments of the Earth system, should also be possible through this approach of rigorously quantifying stratigraphy. And so what we're trying to build towards is supporting science at scales ranging from regional down to local. And so Macrostrat, in its core conception, can support stratigraphic columns at any scale. So here is an example where on the left, we have a regional scale stratigraphic column. In the center, we have a slightly more local stratigraphic column that actually houses a different interpretation of the ordering of stratigraphic units in the same basin. And then on the right, we have a single measured section with a single carbon isotope record beside it. So Macrostrat can support these column data sets at multiple scales. And the large problem is that there's just a large number of column data sets at fine scales, and entering them is a challenge. We've started making progress on this problem, first by integrating with the ocean drilling programs who maintain an extensive set of stratigraphic column data sets at the borehole level for all of the ocean drilling sites around the world. And so in partnership with the ocean drilling programs, we're actually linking these column data sets together with Macrostrat and recording very fine scale columns in Macrostrat's data system. This same high resolution measured section approach can be applied to terrestrial column data sets, which we're working on new data entry tools for compiling these types of data sets and expressing them. We're also working on easier to use software for entering stratigraphic data sets. So the current data entry workflows to Macrostrat are difficult and time consuming and take months to train students in our lab on how to appropriately enter stratigraphic columns. But our goal is to make software workflows that enable collaborative column entry. And this diagram is illustrative to show the complex software design work that goes into making these types of tools that are easy to use. So this is a flow chart for how a user would pick a stratigraphic name, potentially from names that already exist, or if a name is not found, then be able to create their own stratigraphic name. I would be remiss, especially at this time, right after the UNESCO DDE forum in Paris, which I just returned from, to not mention that one of our biggest hopes for collaboration is collaborating with a wide range of earth scientists with local knowledge of specific basins and specific areas of work and specific scientific problems that they want to solve. And one example of a forum for these types of collaboration could be the Deep Time Digital Earth project, which has many global collaborators and is hoping to form a network to build these types of data approaches more broadly. So we're hoping through collaborations with DD researchers to build links between the paleobio database and the geobio database, Macrostrat and One Stratigraphy, and other links through the Earth system. So that is something that we're hoping to do more in the future. So we're excited about that. Next, for just a few more minutes, I'm aware that I am at time here, but I want to say just a few words about Macrostrat as a platform for geological exploration, because the other thing that we do, even while we're doing important science, is build tools to express this data in ways that help build context for other geologists, solving more local problems. And so basically, Macrostrat provides a platform by which many users can use its services in many different ways. And so the basics of this is that there's a web accessible API, so a machine readable interface, which we then use to build web interfaces on top of. And so our web interface allows you to look at our geologic map in a variety of ways, put fossil data sets on top of it, link to publications directly using links to the literature that we've compiled with machine reading, and many different things. And we're working on better visualization, paleogeography, and things like that. And as a last piece of this, we also want to bring these tools to the wider community of geoscientists and the public. And so the message there is everything has to happen in a web browser or on a mobile device, because that's where people have the computing resources to engage with us. And so I would recommend that those in the audience take a look at our Rocked app, which is a pretty remarkable tool, first for looking at the geologic map, capturing your field data, but then also sharing it with other users. So sharing outcrops that are particularly exciting or good field locations, and then linking those into field trips for others to share. And so this has proved to be a popular approach, because it allows us to take these global resources that we're compiling and make them useful to geologists who want to compile local data sets and use them to express their local geology. And so we've had thousands of these check-ins created for individual rock outcrops, and have many thousands of active users as well. So this is a very good example of how these large-scale data resources can work to the benefit, not just of geologists doing big data research, but also to those who want to have a large collection of geologic maps and associated data, and even user compiled data in their pocket. So we're hoping to help build a linked system of ways to engage with and interpret the rock record through digital techniques. And we're happy to have collaborations in that regard. So thank you very much for your time. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you, Daven. Now it's time question for our participants. So feel free to open your mic to ask a question, or you could type a question in the chat and I could read the question on your behalf.
Hi, Daven. This is Brian. We actually overlapped at Caltech when I was in grad school.
Oh yeah,
I was in
Brian.
Seismic Lab.
Now that I've seen your face, I'm like, oh yes, okay, of course.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, it's good to see another fellow Caltecher succeeding and surviving in the real world. Oh yeah, this is really impressive stuff, and the software and the approaches that you're using are very impressive, and I think they're going in the right direction, especially with the mobile and social components. So my question is kind of a small technical one. One of your earlier slides, you were showing how you can get some really impressive age refinement with Macrostrat. And
sure,
so I'm a little confused by the process by which the age is refined like by that much. So you mentioned that your continuous time age model does like a linear interpolation between stratigraphic units. So is it
right?
Interpolation or more of like a smoothing effect? So like does it take into account like intrinsic uncertainty or noise levels in those measurements and then kind of smooths over them, or is it basically connects the line between every sample that you have and then provides that really precise age range?
Right. So our age model, it connects a line essentially between the tops and bottoms of these stratigraphic units, but not all of the stratigraphic units. There are units with known age constraints that basically are pinned, and then a line is connected through to the next known age constraint. So this is actually an extremely simplistic stratigraphic model, and there are many other ways to make a stratigraphic model that are more respectful of the episodic nature of sedimentary deposition. But at this large time scale, it's actually pretty appropriate. Now, there's actually two things going on in our compression or our ability to refine these ages, because it's not all based on our time modeling. What it's often based on is that geologic maps are more focused on a spatial representation of units and are not concerned as much with the time representation of units, and often are lumping units together that have close but not identical representations in time, because they're similar map units. And so what we're basically doing is not necessarily modeling the ages better. We're just parsing out components of that bin and saying, oh, well, you've marked this as Triassic, but we know the Chinle Formation from our stratigraphic work and our correlations is this part of the Triassic. And so it's basically just refining the map description against the column description in many cases. And the limiting case of that is actually what I was talking about with this Pluton case, because it's basically that this geologic map of the state of Colorado in this case, or I think one part of the state of Colorado, has a map unit that is binned as plutons of Mesoproterozoic age. But we know that the plutons in this region are all of this Colorado mineral belt age. And so we're able to refine that to a much tighter time constraint based on that knowledge. So it's not necessarily a better modeling of the age, because our modeling is extremely simple. It's simple in part to avoid making complicating assumptions, but it's really just a data linking challenge in many cases.
Right, and so the way that you link the data is to link them with your common stratigraphic name, and I guess that's like an aggregator in a way to kind of refine, get almost like reduce the noise by square root of n or something like that.
Something like that in a way, yeah. It's basically
getting
It's getting around the problem that traditionally geologic mapping data sets or geologic data sets are compiled either in a time stratigraphic column framework or in a mapping framework. And often the mappers don't talk to the people compiling the columns that closely, or often they're the same people. It just depends on the scale of the project. And so what we're trying to do is pull those back together to form kind of a four-dimensional representation of the Earth's crust, which some would argue that that's how how data should be compiled in the first place. But it's also very hard to do that, to make a 3D model as your first approach. Mapping and stratigraphy are both very straightforward processes. So somebody has to do this linking, and we're just doing it at scale, essentially.
Right. Very cool. Very cool. Yeah. Thanks for answering, and best of luck out there. Yep.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, next question, please. Okay, I have a quick question. So could you go back to the slide where you're trying to calculate the area of the continental crust?
Yes.
Yeah, could you elaborate that because I didn't.
So sorry, this one with or
I think
the igneous
one,
area with
there's one about using the zircons to infer.
Oh yes, okay, right.
Tell the coverage of the.
Right. So yeah, sorry. Here's I think the slide. Is that correct?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so did you just want me to talk through this confusing chart again? Or
yeah.
Right.
Could you elaborate on this slide a little bit?
Yes, certainly. So this there's two things going on here, and I actually didn't even talk about the bottom panel of this chart, but the top panel here basically shows this black curve with a gray error bar around it. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but is basically the area of igneous rock in geologic maps of the crust at that time. So basically, the amount of igneous rock that was being formed. So just focusing on that line, we see the largest peak in the Archean and then a peak in the Paleoproterozoic. So that corresponds to the Wilson cycle of supercontinent formation. And generally the pace of addition of continental crustal area as crystalline rock through time. Okay, so that's basically the most continental crust was created in the Archean and then in the Paleoproterozoic. So that's one signal. And then the second order signal here, then focusing on the zircons, which are these smooth curves in color, are basically that unlike the igneous rock area, there is actually more zircon from the more recent igneous episodes. So there's more, the peaks are higher. So if we focus on this red curve, which is all of the detroidal zircon in our data set, there's a slightly higher peak in the Mesoproterozoic than there is in the Paleoproterozoic, and there's a much higher peak than there is in the Archean. And so what that basically says, we know generally that the amount of zircons that was produced by igneous rock of similar igneous rock types, and we actually did a little bit of modeling to make sure that the increasing or decreasing iron content of the igneous rocks didn't affect this too much, but there should be an equivalent number of zircons sourced from those older igneous rocks and arriving in sedimentary data sets. And so that's, we don't see that those zircons there. This first Archean peak of zircon should be much higher. But then what is interesting, and I didn't really do justice to in the main talk, is that we actually see a trend when we look at specific time slices of sedimentary rock. If we look at Cambrian sedimentary rock, and then Ordovician sedimentary rock, and then Mesozoic and Cenozoic. So we have different colored curves here, which are basically subsets of this red curve, corresponding to different ages of sedimentary rock. And we actually see Cambrian sedimentary rocks had more Archean zircons and more Paleoproterozoic zircons. And then Ordovician sedimentary rocks had less, and then Mesozoic and Cenozoic sedimentary rocks had even less of these oldest zircon sets, while they were enriched in younger zircon sets. So what we're seeing is actually a fairly complicated signal of continental unroofing and resedimentation and we haven't fully explored this yet, but it basically implies that there is a lot of missing zircon, and that if we are able to look at the specific ages of these sedimentary rocks, we can tell that there was one big pulse of erosion associated with the Cambrian boundary that got rid of a lot of zircon. But there was also probably one big pulse of erosion before the Cambrian boundary at some point in time that got rid of a lot of zircon. And it's not part of the continental sedimentary system that we can see. So I hope that cleared things up a bit, because it's still, to me, a bit of a brain twister. But the other way to express this top panel, which I explained somewhat complexly, was the bottom panel basically shows how many zircons we see in our total data set per unit igneous rock area. So given the amount of igneous rock that is available to be eroded, how many zircons we actually find in a sedimentary rock. And so we basically find almost no Archean zircons relative to how many there should be. But we find many more Mesoproterozoic and Neoproterozoic zircons. So there's a lot of missing zircons in the rock record, is basically the takeaway of this whole chart. And I suppose those missing zircons are in the ocean basins, would be my answer. Or they were in the ocean basins and have since been subducted and are now in the mantle. But you know, I think we're going to do further research in this direction to try and tease out some of these signals.
Okay, I think it's a very interesting and inspiring plot, because one of my students and I are working on the continental crust composition, and it's pretty interesting.
Right.
Okay, I'll jump to the next question. Next question is graduate student from Zhejiang University, Liu Yang, and asking about a question relevant to your the paper published in the annual review of Earth Planetary Sciences 2022. And she's wondering how you use the North American data in a Macrostrat database to extrapolate and reveal the macroevolutionary law in the global range. So would there be any scope of bias?
Right, and so there are two answers to this, which is basically we think that we are able to confidently state that the signals that we are finding are real and constitute a global law. And the reason for that is because even though we don't sample all of the rocks in the continental crust, North America, by virtue of being a relatively large craton, approximately a quarter of the Earth's continental surface of sedimentary rocks is in the North American craton. It's actually got enough rocks, and it's well sampled through time. So the critical sampling thing is not necessarily that we see all of the rocks, but that we have a good enough sampling through time that we're able to evaluate the changes in sedimentary rock flux over those times. And the hope is that the sedimentary basins are long-lived enough and continuous enough that they can record depositional changes, and that would impact or be involved with this macroevolutionary law over time. And because North America's famous SOC sequence and central North America stratigraphic basin is so extensive, this is actually a very good continuous record to sample. Now, that said, the other side to this question is there certainly is likely to be some sort of bias, because we could be evaluating this law against all of the rocks, and we are only evaluating it against a subset. But let me see if I have the plot in here, because there was one plot that speaks a little bit to this in one of the papers, but no, I guess I don't. But basically, one of the arguments for Macrostrat's approach is that people who did this in the 80s and 90s with a much smaller sampling of rocks were able to actually illuminate the same large-scale trends. So part of the large-scale picture is that we expect, even if we added a lot more rock area, we're still working with enough sampling that we would catch the major trends, even if we saw some differences. But that said, nobody has tabulated these rocks in the same way on the other cratons yet. So it's likely that something will change. And so the question is, what exactly is that? And the hope is that that wouldn't be a overturning of the global laws that were proposed, but perhaps it could be. So, that is why we need to establish more global data sets, almost as kind of a second check and a verification of these results.
Okay, any more questions? Or any question, the last question? Okay, I think we have ran enough time. And so Daven, could you stop sharing your screen? And everyone, could you open your video? And let's show our appreciation for our speaker for a minute, and then we could end the meeting today.
Yes, thank you all for coming.